India is home to 1 in every 6 people on the planet. It has just become the fourth largest economy in the world and is now worth over $4 trillion. Yet, many still use the phrase third world when they talk about India. Why? Before we get into the numbers, let's clear something up. The term third world never started out as a label for poverty. It was born in the Cold War to describe countries that weren't aligned with either the US or the Soviet Union. India fell into that group, not because it was poor, but because it chose to remain non-aligned. Over time, though, the meaning changed. Many of those non-aligned nations were newly independent, still grappling with the scars of colonialism, fragile institutions, and weak economies. Slowly, Third World turned into shorthand for being poor or underdeveloped. But the problem is that it throws very different countries into the same bucket, from oil-rich Gulf states to struggling agrarian economies. That's why today, many say that the term is outdated, even misleading, and prefer words like Global South or simply developing countries. But then, why even ask if India is still a third world country in 2025? Because the paradox is that a nation that's now the world's most populous, the fourth largest economy, a rising global power, is still struggling with poverty, inequality, and job creation. The question isn't just whether India has outgrown the label. The real question is, can a country be both a global giant and a developing nation at the same time? Let's dive into it. Let's begin with scale. In 2025, India's economy is valued at approximately $4.19 trillion, making it the fourth largest in the world, surpassing the UK, France, and even Japan. That sheer economic size gives India considerable global weight. But the story deepens when you consider its scale again. India is now the world's most populous country, with around 1.45 billion people, meaning 1 out of every 6 humans alive today is Indian. Now let's do the math. Divide that massive GDP by its enormous population, and India's nominal GDP per capita comes to just about $2,880. That places it at a far lower rung compared to wealthier nations. For context, the average American earns nearly $80,000, and even China's per capita is over $13,600. To add perspective, despite India's enormous economy, its per capita income ranking remains low globally, around 136, reflecting how deep the gap remains between aggregate size and individual wealth. So yes, India is a giant, but it's a giant with relatively shallow pockets. And that tension between scale and per-person reality is the thread that runs through this entire story. Now here's the plot twist. In just over a decade, India has delivered one of the most remarkable anti-poverty turnarounds in modern history. Back in 2011-2012, about 27.1% of Indians, over 344 million people, lived in extreme poverty, surviving at under $3 per day. By 2022-23, that share had plunged to just 5.3%, or roughly 75 million people. That's nearly 269 million people lifted out of extreme poverty in just 11 years. How extraordinary is that? To put that into perspective, that's like wiping out poverty for the entire populations of Indonesia and South Africa combined. But there's more context here. Rural extreme poverty fell more sharply, from 18.4% to 2.8%, while urban poverty declined from 10.7% to 1.1%, narrowing the urban-rural poverty gap significantly. The drop wasn't due to statistical tweaks alone. Even though the World Bank raised its global poverty line from $2.15 to $3 per day, India still achieved this dramatic reduction. That makes India a positive statistical outlier on the global map. What drove this success? A mix of expanded social programs like PM Awas Yojana, Ujjwala, Jan Dhan, Ayushman Bharat, the rise of digital direct benefit transfers, reducing leakage, and broad-based growth in rural incomes and infrastructure. The world doesn't talk enough about this. India's poverty reduction isn't just impressive, it's historic. But escaping poverty doesn't mean living in prosperity. The UN's Human Development Index, which measures education, health, and living standards, places India at 0.685, ranking it around 130 out of 193 countries. That's better than before, but it still keeps India in the medium human development bracket, behind nations like Sri Lanka or Vietnam. And inequality? This is where the story gets tricky. Official consumption-based data gives India a Gini index of around 25.5, which sounds surprisingly equal, but the actual experience says otherwise. Why? Because those surveys don't fully capture wealth concentration or the lifestyles of the ultra-rich. The truth is, India has both sprawling billion-dollar homes in Mumbai and at the same time, families in rural Jharkhand that live without electricity or healthcare. So inequality depends on which lens you use. Statistically, the gap looks modest. Socially, it feels massive. Now, if we ask what's fueling India's rise, the answer is clear. Services. Over half of India's GDP now comes from services: IT, software, digital payments, logistics, and finance. India is a superpower in exporting IT services. Indian firms and engineers power companies across the globe. That's why Bengaluru is called the Silicon Valley of the East. But here's the challenge. Services often create fewer jobs compared to manufacturing, which is why India has been pushing Make in India, pouring billions into infrastructure, offering incentives for electronics, semiconductors, and defense manufacturing. Roads, highways, ports, they're all expanding at record speed. Still, manufacturing hasn't yet become the job-creating engine it needs to be. And with millions of young Indians entering the workforce every year, the big question is, can India create enough good jobs, not just jobs? Perhaps the best way to understand India is to not see it as one country, but many countries stitched together. In Kerala, literacy is nearly universal at 96%, and life expectancy is close to 75 years, comparable to parts of Europe. Tamil Nadu has built a strong industrial base in automobiles and electronics, while Karnataka's capital Bengaluru is now ranked among the world's top tech hubs. Maharashtra with Mumbai remains the country's financial powerhouse, contributing over 14% of national GDP. But the picture changes elsewhere. In states like Bihar, Orissa, Uttar Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh, child malnutrition remains above 40%. Unemployment among youth is higher than the national average, and literacy hovers closer to 70%. Female labor force participation across India is just 37%, but in some of these states, it's still under 20%, reflecting social and economic barriers. This is India's dual reality, a nation sprinting into the future with world-class industries and social progress in some regions, while others are still weighed down by basic development challenges. And it's this stark contrast that makes answering the third world question so complicated. So, is India still a third world country? The honest answer is this: the label itself is outdated, a Cold War relic. In reality, India is now a middle-income nation with a $4 trillion economy, a leader in IT services, and a country that has made historic progress in reducing poverty. But India is also home to glaring inequalities, regional divides, and development challenges that still resemble those of low-income nations. The truth is, India is both things at once: skyscrapers and slums, billionaires and subsistence farmers, digital banks and villages without broadband. The important consideration now shouldn't be whether India is third world or not. The real concern now should be this: can India's next decade transform these two Indias into one story of shared prosperity? And that's the chapter the world is waiting to read.